she made a few posts about masks, and one of them says, "Meanwhile, in California," and has a person with a whole bunch of masks on. You know, the joke is California is so left wing that they have so many masks on. You're right, because that's how left wing they are. Is this a straightforwardly saying masks are stupid, or is it just a fucking joke? I think you can interpret it either way. It's really, I think, comes down to how sensitive you are. I hate to say that, because, but the there is this concept of people double masking and then even triple masking, and people may look at that and say, that's so ridiculous, you're maybe virtue signaling or whatever. Maybe that's what this is a reference toward, I don't know, but or maybe it's like inspired by that, but I wouldn't call it anti-mask. She's someone that likes masks, thinks masks are a great idea. I could see them sharing this. It's not a big deal. Someone else says, or excuse me, another post that Gina shared was, in a world where everyone wears a mask, it's a privilege to see a soul. This is one of those things, I saw the term boomer meme in description of some of the things Gina would share. And maybe boomers won't like that term, and that's fine, I understand. But it's meant that the term boomer meme, it's like, think of what your grandma would share on social media, right? Which, you don't have to be a grandma to be a boomer. But think about that. What much older people share on social media, and it just kind of looks silly at times. Like, this has no meaning. It's so vacuous, and there's nothing there. I can't even criticize it because I don't even know what it is. What does that mean? But it's one of the things being shared. So, is she anti-mask? I say there's no evidence, right? There's no evidence that she's anti-mask. But I'm going to get to the accusation of being a COVID denier in a second, and maybe, and I think some items that are more troubling are here, but whether they're fireable is another question. So she says, she shared something that was being, excuse me, I am sick, so I'm sorry. I'm going to be coughing a lot. But she shared something from someone named Dr. Elizabeth Hess, and it says, copied after I verified it. Look for the link below that takes you to the CDC site. And that's the only original line from this person. The rest is something she copied, and it begins, this week the CDC quietly updated the COVID number to admit that only 6% of all the over 150,000 deaths recorded actually died from COVID. So the thing that she's sharing from the CDC site, it says for 6% of the deaths, COVID-19 was the only cause mentioned. Now, I want you to think about that sentence for a second, and if you read it as literal as possible, it does kind of seem like it's saying only 6% died of COVID, but that's actually not the case. Keep in mind, look at that byline. It says comorbidities, and comorbidities are something you have in conjunction to COVID. And actually, and the sentence preceding that is actually sort of talking about that. It's saying, Table 3 shows the types of health conditions and contributing causes mentioned in conjunction with deaths involving coronavirus. Now, someone that maybe is not, as savvy when it comes to, maybe medical terminology, or just was reading it too casually, just honed in on that 6% number. And sometimes a cognitive bias is created when someone tells us what something says, and then we read that thing, and it, we tend to be more casual in how we read it. We're not reading it as deeply and critically because we already have an interpretation in our mind. So I imagine that's what happens a lot. And I imagine that was at play actually during the hashtag Fire Gina Carano movement, because when things are shared and they say, this is an example of anti-Semitism, and then people say, oh, it is anti-Semitic. But in any event, getting off track, this is, it's obviously incorrect. This Dr. Elizabeth Hess person is incorrect about her interpretation of the CDC data. So it's very disappointing that Gina Carano shared that. And I wonder how Gina feels today, because she shared this in August of 2020. Gina has other posts related to COVID and could be interpreted as COVID denial or COVID skepticism or whatever, thinking the numbers are exaggerated or overblown. But Gina Carano never outright says it, except in this case. And I wonder if anyone gave her a talking to, said, look, that's a misinterpretation of the COVID data, which to me is all it takes. Have a conversation with her, talk to her, say, this is what a comorbidity is. But to attempt to fire her is ridiculous. I think if a person in a high status, let's say the World Health Organization or the CDC, shared this and said only 6% are dying from COVID, well then yeah, I would want them fired because that's their job, right? She's an actress. She accidentally misread this data and shared it. And I think, to me, I have more forgiveness, right? I mean, I think you should be allowed a certain latitude to make a mistake. Now, does she still believe it today? It, I don't know. But let me just note that Mel Q, someone named Mel Q, uh, which you can tell by the Q in her name, maybe it kind of hints it, but she's a QAnon supporter, and she shared this information as well. Now I don't know who shared it first. I just know that when Mel Q shared it, it's in quotes. So she got it from someone. So from someone, she copied the exact post and shared it with the misinterpretation of the CDC data. And Mel Q is apparently so prominent that, because she is a QAnon organizer, that even Donald Trump saw it and then retweeted it. Now that's disgraceful. But in any event, Mel Q shared it, and then people therefore are calling it a QAnon conspiracy theory, which I have problems with, that anything a QAnon conspiracy theorist shares or lays their hand on is therefore a QAnon conspiracy, because to me, I don't know where it originated, okay? I just know it looks like an honest misreading of the CDC data or CDC website. But to call it a QAnon conspiracy theory, I guess I'm just troubled by that the QAnon folks can come over, lay their hand on any conspiracy theory or honest misreading of something, and then therefore it's now part of QAnon. And if someone like Gina Carano is duped and she shares it, this honest misreading, she's therefore a QAnon supporter based off that. And I know there's other stuff that she shared that you can argue is also an example of QAnon support, but I'm going to get to that. I'm just talking about this for the meantime. So here's another item that Gina Carano shared involving what you can interpret as COVID denial, and it is a Twitter exchange. And what she says is, the world is open, but no one is allowed to work. Working is a right you as an American have. It gives us purpose, focus, pride, and most importantly, a way to support the ones we love. People are dropping like flies from depression and suicide, overdoses, murder. Enough already. And then another post she shares, keep in mind this is all September 6th. Another post she shares, open up your businesses and churches. Put whatever regulations you want to, because that is your right, but open them up. You're telling me COVID-19 knows the difference between a protest or praise and worship. I haven't even been to church in over a decade, but I sure would go now. And someone responds to this, and they say, just apply some basic logic. The protests have been mostly outdoors with participants wearing masks. This, remember, is This, remember, is referring to the Black Lives Matter protests. But this person continues. Most church services are indoors, and many conservatives have been resistant to wearing masks. Yes, the virus responds differently to those situations. It's not rocket science. Gina then replies, and by now we're in September 12th, she says, then why did they ban going to the parks and beaches? Why did they prohibit churches from having services in their parking lots? Why did they just try to ban Halloween for kids in LA, but then walked it back because there was such an outrage over the hypocrisy? Hypocrisy 2020. So what I'm wanting you to take away from this exchange, first of all, this is one of the examples that is somewhat indicative that she has some skepticism on COVID, on not necessarily that COVID exists at all, but just that COVID is as bad as people are saying. So that's me reading between the lines of what she's saying. But keep in mind, a lot of people are saying, open up your businesses, blah, 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 that aren't in denial at all. In fact, I'm going to read in a moment something from the World Health Organization that essentially is also talking about how they don't like the idea of lockdowns being the primary means of controlling the virus. And I know it caused Donald Trump to say, hey, look, I'm right, blah, blah, blah. It goes deeper than that, right? I'm not going to get into comparing what the World Health Organization said to what Donald Trump said. I'm going to try to stay focused on Gina. But here's what the World Health Organization talked about. They said, we are aware that lockdowns are again a topic of discussion as countries deal with surges of COVID-19. We understand that sometimes such measures, although not sustainable, are needed to swiftly suppress the virus and avoid health systems being overwhelmed. And they go on to say in a separate tweet, lockdowns are not sustainable solutions because of their significant economic, social, and broader health impacts. However, during the COVID-19 pandemic, There have been times when restrictions were necessary, and there may be other times in the future. So what I hope you can gather from hearing that from the World Health Organization is that there is a diversity of opinion on using lockdowns as your primary response. And so to say that anti-lockdown is inherently something of the far right, or even that it's fireable, is silly. That'd be like if you want Gina Carano for opposing lockdowns to be fired, then how do you feel about the World Health Organization? I guess the World Health Organization could never, none of their people could ever be in the Mandalorian, right? They'd hashtag fire World Health Organization official. Anyways, Gina Carano also supported anti-lockdown protests, which do tend to be not only conservative, but also intermixed with far-right conspiracy theories that totally deny COVID is happening. So in this one, this is from one that was in Britain, and it's called the Unite for Freedom rally, and she shared a few posts on this, including audio from a speech from one of those far-right conspiracy fellows. His name David, let's see, how do you say his name? David Icke or something like that. Yeah, David Icke. But I'm just going to quote part of it. And so the speech says, "We have a virus so intelligent that it only infects those that are taking part in protests that governments want to stop. Why is it nonsense? Because they are making it up. So why are they doing that? Simple. Current events are not random. They have not just happened." And he also interprets these anti-lockdown, he interprets these lockdown measures being taken in the UK as fascist and as part of subjugation, right? Or part of an effort at global subjugation is what he says. But obviously, let me really break this down. First of all, he's full of crap, but at the same time, there are problems with leaders in various nations using COVID as an excuse to crack down on people's rights. So if you're a strongman, you're going to use this pandemic, this crisis, as a means to consolidate your power. And it's happened in various nations. No surprise, but that doesn't mean that COVID is nonsense, that it doesn't exist. But he is pointing to, say, the protests. I don't know what protests he's referring to in the UK, but I will note that the Black Lives Matter protests had international solidarity, so it happened in different nations. So I can tell you that much. But as far as inconsistency in when we apply stringent measures against COVID, well, that's causing a lot of people to doubt whether COVID exists at all. Now, that sucks that interpretation is being taken. Instead of saying, well, the government is behaving sloppily or silly or absurd, it's that, wait a minute, do they even believe that COVID is even happening? You're not taking it seriously. Why should I? You're acting as if it's not even a problem if you're saying go out and protest and stand arm in arm with a mask hanging off, and then why should I take it seriously? You don't seem to be believing your own narrative. And that is fuel for conspiracy theory. And it sucks because, let's face it, if you're on the left wing, you were supportive of those Black Lives Matter protests in the United States. And I'm speaking away from David Icke, whatever protest he's referring to, but in the United States, that same inconsistency existed. And which already mentioned the tweet exchange where Gina talks about this, the protests. And she cites that inconsistency. Now, yes, in the, excuse me, I am sick, but in the United States, the left wing, whether you're talking Bernie Sanders or Kamala Harris or whomever, even just mainstream Democrats, you were supportive of the Black Lives Matter protests. I was supportive as well. But let's be real. To say you support the protests without, in the same breath, emphasizing that if you were not to comply with safety measures regarding COVID, then don't even protest. Don't even step out and protest. Don't be there. You got to do both. Or you look, anytime you mention the protest, you got to say that. Now, I can't cross-examine every time Democratic candidates talked about it. I did recently read a few quotes from Kamala Harris, and she didn't really put a lot of emphasis on being safe while you're out there and what to do and how to ensure people do stay safe. Because if you don't say that, then you're not being consistent. Because those protests were a hotbed for COVID infection. There's no telling how many there's no telling how many deaths can be ascribed to all the protests, not just left wing but right wing, just all of them that happened throughout 2020. How many deaths can be ascribed to that? There's no telling. And I can show you pictures of the Black Lives Matter protests. There's an assumption that everyone's standing away from one another and wearing masks. They're not. They're just, many times, these are not randomly selected pictures. They're actually pictures I could find from very generic, like Good Morning America, or Good Morning America, and also Yahoo.com. And you can see they're standing right next to each other, no masks in some instances. And that's a huge problem. Wear a mask or don't be there. And that's how the left wing should have handled that. I, for one, do have an opinion about protests where it troubled me from the beginning, where people were, before the Black Lives Matter protests happening, right-wing people were wanting to protest. And it troubled me the generic attitude people had about protests, saying, now is not a time to protest. Protests don't need to happen. And keep in mind, protests are how we stand up to the government. So how are we supposed to stand up to the government? So I always, from the beginning, had this view of protests there has to be a new approach to protests where on the spot, organizers are making sure everybody's standing apart from one another, wearing masks, etc. Or if those people are not complying, then they need to leave, right? So, in any event, Anti-Vax, is Gina Carano anti-vax? Well, she shared this. It says, sure, I'll take the vaccine. Just mail it to me. My health and safety are too important to show up in person. Just like mail-in voting, safe, secure, and honest. So just mail it to me, and I'll give myself the shot and send the paperwork back saying I'm vaccinated. You all trust me, right? So I've read this post many times, and the reason being is because it's bizarre. It's a bizarre post, and it's a bizarre post to reference as like why she should be fired to even mention in this argument. But if people shared it, then I have to talk about it. So I don't think this is anti-vaccination. It's saying that it's trying to compare vaccines she's trying to, in this meme, in a sloppy way, trying to say, well, what if vaccines had the same rules as mail-in voting, right? And then let's do everything step by step as you would when participating in mail-in voting. And she said, see, you don't trust it. You don't trust me to take the vaccine. I'm not saying her comparison's good. I'm saying she's trying to talk about mail-in voting. And it's not anti-vaccination. But this is about as close as we get to anti-vaccination. But even if you are anti-vax, let's say you are. Let's say that is anti-vaccination, that post. Should she be fired for that post? Should it be mentioned? Well, look, just let me let you know that 32% of Americans say that they probably won't or definitely won't get the COVID vaccine. And that's a poll that was taken from late January to February 1st. And then there's also 38% of Americans who say they outright don't trust the vaccine. And I'm troubled by those numbers. You should be too. But let me just note that me even mentioning this, I'm just trying to talk about the general political climate right now. And that many people have doubts about the vaccination is 1/3 of Americans. Therefore, they can't work on the Mandalorian. They can't be a mercenary or whatever role there is on the Mandalorian. What about the left-wing Hollywood left that have been promoting the anti-vax conspiracy theories up until this point? They've been pushing, and probably has massaged public opinion to be more susceptible to anti-vaccination sentiment, therefore leading to these numbers being as high as they are. What about that? The Jenny McCarthy's, the Tim Robbins. Are they able to work on The Mandalorian, even though they sort of changed their tune when it comes to the COVID vax? So, I don't know. In any event, I'm mentioning things that are sort of really irrelevant because Gina never took an anti-vaccination statement or a stance. I mean, you're kind of left to guess that maybe she's anti-vax, and this thing that mentions vaccinations is therefore indicative of her being anti-vax or skeptical of vaccinations. But there's no evidence. That's my verdict on that. So in the next video, I'll talk about the accusations that Gina Carano espoused various conspiracy theories, including ones associated with QAnon, and the accusation that she was anti-Black Lives Matter and that she didn't believe in systemic racism. So make sure to watch that.